Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the new Life Science Biology Regents exam. I've split this video up into two parts. The first part of this video is going to be me talking about the format of this test. The second part of this video is going to be me going over some practice problems. So if you're just here for practice problems, I've included a timestamp on when the review starts. Feel free to skip ahead. So for everyone that's still watching and wants to figure out the format of this test and what is actually happening, the Living Environment Regents exam is being replaced by the Life Science Biology Regents exam. Okay, so there's going to be no more Living Environment Regents exams very soon. The first time or the first day that this exam will be administered or given to students is going to be on June 10th, 2025. Okay, and after this Regents season, after this June has passed, the Living Environment Regents exam will no longer be given to students. Okay, and everyone will have to take the Life Science Biology Regents exam. Right? So this is the replacement. This is going to be the new standard. This is what students are going to have to take from now on out. Okay? So let's look at the test blueprint. For those of you that are confused at what this document is, it's the Educator's Guide to Regents Examination. What that means is that this is the packet that they give all your teachers. It pretty much covers everything that's going to be on the test and what to expect. So if we look at the test blueprint, we know that the test is organized in question clusters, meaning that all questions on this Science Regents examinations are going to be clustered into questions that follow an assessment storyline. Okay? Question clusters include an introduction, which informs students of how many questions are a part of the cluster, multiple stimuli including reading passages, data tables, graphs, diagrams, photos, and questions that draw on one or more of these stimuli. The questions within the cluster will include multiple choice and short response questions. Okay? And finally, everything is going to be 1 point. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between this exam and the previous Living Environment Regents exam. So here I have a copy of an old Regents exam. This is the test that's going to be replaced. You can see here how the questions are not in clusters, right? The questions are not related to one another. Number one is number one, number two is number two. They don't follow a similar storyline. They're about two different things. This one is about DNA, this one's about mitochondria, this one's about an ecosystem, this one's about evolution, right? None of the questions are related to one another, they're not clustered together, and there's no stimuli, meaning that there's no article for you to read, there's no photo for you to analyze, and there's no storyline, okay? This is what the new Regents are going to look like, okay? Here we have our introduction. It's going to say that this cluster is going to be questions 1 through 6, and we're going to base our knowledge off of this paragraph, which is going to be our first stimuli, this photo, which is our second stimuli, this section or this cluster of text, which is our third stimuli, these two photos, which are going to be a fourth and fifth stimuli, followed by our first question. Okay, so we have to read and look at all these photos before we can answer this question that's going to be based on information in these passages. Okay, so let's say we answered question number 1, we move on to question number 2. But hey, it's not going to be another question that's unrelated. It's going to also be about corals or whatever these paragraphs are about. Okay, and you're going to have to read even more stimuli because it's going to build on that. Okay, so these two or three paragraphs were like introducing the issue of coral reef bleaching, and then this paragraph or this part of the article is going to explain how bleaching happens, and then this question is going to build on why bleaching occurs. And then we're going to keep on going through this cluster, and finally we have 2 graphs to analyze, a diagram to analyze, and finally more information that's going to build on whatever was given to us in the previous stimuli. And of course we're going to have questions associated with that. Okay, so this is our first cluster. They were all about coral reefs, and then you're going to move on to your second cluster, which is going to be questions 1 through 5, and it's going to be about dinosaurs. So you're going to have a passage or an article or photos or data about dinosaurs and the environment around dinosaurs, and you're going to have to answer questions that are based on that. So what I'm trying to say here is that this Regents exam is a lot more like a history exam, where you're going to have an article or a photo or a political cartoon and questions that ask you to explain what's going on in the cartoon or the context behind it. In this case, what you're going to be given you're going to get paragraphs that are going to talk about some biological process, and you're going to have to build on that or explain that or examine that or come up with a solution to whatever was introduced in that paragraph or in that issue. All right? So again, the questions are becoming more interconnected, and they're going to be in clusters. So that's the main difference between this old Regents exam and this new format that you guys are all going to take in this June 2025. All right? So let's keep on reading to figure out some more differences. Okay, so we talked about how the stimuli, you can have articles, photos, graphs, whatever. Question formats, we know that it's 1 credit multiple choice questions and 1 credit constructed response questions. What that means is that instead of it all being multiple choice or all being short response, it's a mix. Okay, what's the mix? Well, 60% is multiple choice and 40% is short response. Okay, so there's not a 50-50 split. There's more multiple choice than short response, but they're all worth 1 point. So you don't have to stress out on, oh no, well, what if I'm really bad at short response questions? I'll get more points taken off. No, you won't. You'll get the same amount of points taken off. Everything weighs the same. And finally here, we can see how there's going to be 9 to 11 different clusters of questions, and in total there's going to be 45 to 55 questions. So the old Regents exam was 85 questions long. Now, this new exam is anywhere between 45 to 55 questions. So the Regents board has essentially eliminated 40 to 30 questions for you guys. So it's a much shorter exam now. And it should be a lot more streamlined because it's a lot easier to understand where the questions are coming from because you have so much reference material to go back and read on. Right? If you forgot about a certain topic, well, maybe the article or maybe the diagram will have something that reminds you of that topic or of that issue or that subject. Okay? So my best advice to studying for this exam is, number 1, look over whatever your school gave you. Look over whatever your teacher gave you, your notes, right? My second piece of advice is to look at old Living Environment Regents exams and to specifically look at parts B2, C, and D, because those have some sort of stimuli-based questions as well. Not as much, but they do have questions that are based on graphs and questions that are related to one another in those sections, okay? So again, if you want to really think about this, this new Regents exam kind of got rid of part A and part B1, and it's made the entire exam more like part B2, C, and D. Okay, so it's more like the later parts of the Living Environment Regents exams. Okay, so if you have any questions about this, please let me know in the comments below. I'll try to explain them to the best of my ability, but that is an overview on what this new life science biology exam has in store for you guys. So let's go over some practice problems now. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the coral reef sample cluster, which is a cluster of 6 questions. Keep in mind on your Regents, you're not just going to have one cluster of questions, you're going to have 9 to 11 different clusters with different topics or different subjects. Okay, so it starts up here. My best advice is to always read through always read through the text before answering the question. So here we see that coral reefs are an important marine ecosystem that support more species per unit area than any other marine environment. Reefs protect coastlines from storm and erosion. They provide communities with food, and they have the potential for new medicines. Tourism, diving and snorkeling on reefs adds hundreds of millions of dollars to local businesses. Here we have a photo of a stable coral reef ecosystem, and now we learned that the majority of coral reefs are under stress due to a number of factors. Since 1980, many major episodes of coral bleaching have occurred. When coral reefs are under stress, the coral appears white or bleached. Bleaching or bleached coral might recover, but if stressing conditions continue, they can die. One of the longest and most destructive events from 2014 to 2017 was when over 70% of the world's coral reefs were damaged. Coral biologists claim that Florida reefs and the Great Barrier Reef in Australia have had 90% of their coral affected in recent decades. So here you can really see what they mean by a storyline, right? This exam follows a storyline fashion because, again, this is telling us a story about coral reefs. We had an introduction to them here, and now we have a problem that's facing, or a problem that the coral reefs are facing, right? Bleaching. So it's a wonderful environment. It supports tourism, diving. It gives us money. It gives us medicine. And the reef, or the reef itself, provides homes and food and shelter to many, many different marine life. So the ecosystem as a whole is very reliant on the health of the coral reef, just because so many things depend on if the coral reef is healthy or not. And finally, since the 1980s, the coral reef has not been healthy because it's been dying, aka it's being bleached. All right. So here we have living coral, here we have bleached or dying coral. We can see here how as the coral dies or becomes bleached, the amount of life around it significantly decreases. Look at this photo of a healthy coral, look at how many species are around it, versus this photo of this dying coral, not a lot of species around it, right? So the biodiversity is decreasing. So number 1 asks, which claim best describes the interactions in the coral reef ecosystem since the 1980s and the effect on biodiversity in those regions? So let's look at what's happening here. Well, if we read it, since the 1980s, we know that the coral reef ecosystem has become bleached, meaning that the stability has decreased, right? How do we know that? Well, if we read over here, we know that. If we read here, we understand that the longest and most destructive event because they're describing bleaching as a destructive event, we understand that it's going to decrease the stability. Okay, so automatically we can eliminate choices 1 and 3 because they're saying that the reef ecosystem was stable since the 1980s. No, since the 1980s, the reef ecosystems have become more unstable. Now, that's from reading the passage. Now we need to understand one thing. If an ecosystem is non-stable, that means that its biodiversity is being decreased. Why? Because biodiversity and ecosystem stability are heavily related. So as an environment is more stable, that means its biodiversity is high. As an environment is less stable, its biodiversity is reduced or low. Okay? So from this, we can eliminate choice 2 because it's saying that because the ecosystem is not stable, the biodiversity is remaining relatively constant. That's false. If the coral reef ecosystem is not stable, then the biodiversity has to be reduced. And because the biodiversity is being reduced, it has an impact on the number of tourists visiting the reef. Now there's less fish around it. Now the reefs are less colorful. There's less to see, less to visit, so tourists no longer come there. But again, the main issue here is the fact that the biodiversity is being reduced. And you can either know that because, well, if an ecosystem is not stable, it has low biodiversity, or if you looked at the photos, you could have seen here how a healthy ecosystem and an ecosystem with a healthy coral has more animals living in it than an ecosystem with a dying or bleached coral. All right. So again, instead of having number 2, which is unrelated, number 2 is going to be prefaced by a continuation of this article, right? So the article or the story here that we're following is going to continue down into the second question and so on and so forth. So the next part of this article says that coral reefs form over many thousands of years as tiny animals called polyps produce a calcium carbonate skeleton. This rock-like skeletal structure adds new layers over time, forming the three-dimensional habitat that makes up the reefs. Most polyps depend on a beneficial relationship with a diverse group of photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae. When coral polyps are under stress, some of the zooxanthellae leave the coral polyps, resulting in bleaching. Without zooxanthellae algae, the coral takes on a white appearance and will eventually die. So here, we were introduced to a phenomenon called bleaching, right? And we were introduced to what corals are. And in this section, we actually begin to understand what makes up a coral. What creates coral? Well, these tiny polyps create coral. As they live and as they die off, they deposit calcium carbonate, which is the skeleton of the coral reef. And again, essentially, we need more and more polyps in order for our coral reefs to grow. And these polyps need this photosynthetic zooxanthellae to survive as well. Right? The zooxanthellae, or the algae, lives on or inside of these polyps, and what it does is it provides them with food. So it's a beneficial relationship. So here again, we can see here how we have the polyps. Once they die off, they're going to contribute their calcium carbonate to the skeleton of the reef. Right now they're alive, which is very good. Here we have the photosynthetic algae that are living on their surface that are providing them with the food. And again, we have a enlarged image of whatever's happening up here, okay? So here we have the outside of the tentacle. Here we have the inside of the tentacle where the zooxanthellae live. Number 2 asks us to complete the model below to illustrate the process occurring in the zooxanthellae located in the cells of a coral polyp. Your model should include all inputs of both matter and energy and identify the process involved. So you might be asking, well, what do you mean process, right? What am I answering here? Well, again, this is a very important example of why you need to carefully read these passages, because look what they say about zooxanthellae. They're photosynthetic algae. And if you're photosynthetic, what process are you going to undergo? Well, you're going to undergo photosynthesis, right? So the process here has to be photosynthesis. All right, that's very important, okay? So again, if this completely caught you off guard, please reread the question carefully and specifically read what they're asking you about. So in this case, they're asking us about zooxanthellae, so I would go back and reread this paragraph, and I would scan very closely to the first mention of zooxanthellae. Oh, wait, the first mention of zooxanthellae right before that is a word that describes them as photosynthetic, meaning that they're undergoing photosynthesis. So the rest of this question is now pretty easy. We just have to go ahead and, figure out the inputs of photosynthesis. Well, what has to enter photosynthesis, or what does photosynthesis require? Well, it requires sunlight plus CO2 plus H2O, or water, and it produces sugar plus O2. So our inputs then have to be sunlight, carbon dioxide, or CO2, and H2O, or water. And our outputs have to be sugar and O2, or oxygen. Okay, so again, please read the questions very carefully. Another key piece of information that we're given here were that coral polyps being under stress, when the coral polyps are stressed, the zooxanthellae leave the polyps. That results in bleaching. So here we get an explanation as to why bleaching actually occurs. It occurs when the zooxanthellae, these algae, leave the polyps, okay? So again, we're building on the story of coral reefs. We now know why they get bleached. So now we continue our story. One potential source of stress on coral reefs is atmospheric carbon dioxide, which dissolves in seawater, forming carbonic acid. When excess carbon dioxide is present, it changes the acidity of the ocean water and the availability of calcium carbonate for organisms to build and maintain their shells, skeletons, and other calcium carbonate-based structures. So this part is showing us how one of these stresses that lead to coral bleaching is CO2 in the atmosphere and the acidity of the ocean. Then it follows up by saying that research shows that another stressor is the current trend of large-scale temperature in the ocean. This causes the zooxanthellae to either leave or be ejected from the coral polyps. The graph shows the changes in ocean conditions over the past century. So here we have two diagrams that are going to explain these two trends, right, or these two stressors. So the first two stressors are CO2 and acidity. The third stressor is going to be temperature. So we can see here how the trend in temperature is that it's been increasing over time, meaning that the stressor is high temperature. As the temperature increases, more zooxanthellae are going to be ejected from the polyps, and the polyps are going to die out, and the coral is going to become bleached. Now, let's take a look at what happens with CO2. As you increase the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, what happens? Well, you have less calcium carbonate available in the environment, and as a result, less shells are formed, and less polyps can survive, right? Because as the CO2 level increases, the ocean becomes more acidic. As the ocean becomes more acidic, less polyps have calcium carbonate, coral reefs grow slower, and as a result, the environment kind of stops growing. You can't replenish the dead or damaged coral reefs anymore, right? So now let's look at choice 3, or number 3. It asks us which claim best explains how continual changes in ocean acidity would affect the stability of the coral reef ecosystem. Well, what did we just say here? We said here how increased levels of carbon dioxide make the ocean more acidic, which decreases the amount of calcium carbonate in the water, which then decreases the amount of shells that are formed. So which choice follows this? So which one of these choices is going to relate to that? Well, it can't be choice 1 because it's saying that decreased dissolved carbon dioxide will decrease the acidity of oceans. Okay, well, this part is right. Decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved makes the ocean less acidic. We know that from this diagram. As it increases, it becomes more acidic. As it decreases, it becomes less acidic. But what about the second part of this choice? It says, because the ocean is less acidic, it causes the ocean water to warm. That's false. That ocean water, the temperature of the ocean water and the acidity of the ocean water are two separate factors, right? They're not related to one another. If they were related, the passage would have said so. The passage never said that, so we can't assume that. All right, number 2 says, as the acidity of the ocean increases, the coral polyps will not have enough calcium carbonate to form their skeletons. This is going to be the correct answer for choice 3 because it follows exactly what this diagram says and exactly what I said, right? As the acidity increases, you have less calcium carbonate available, and, well, what do we make shells out of? We make shells out of calcium carbonate. So if there's less calcium carbonate, there's less shells for the polyps to use. Okay, choices 3 and 4 are both false because ocean acidification does not reverse the effects of ocean warming. That's not what the graphs told us. That's not what the passage told us. In choice 4, the coral polyps will need to adapt. Again, the graphs don't tell us that the coral polyps need to adapt, so we can't answer that. Number 4 asks us to use evidence from the information provided to support an explanation of how biotic and abiotic factors affect the carrying capacity of shell-building organisms, such as corals in reef ecosystems. Okay, so here let's go over what this question asks us. They want us to use evidence. This is a key word. Using evidence is something that's new on this Regents, right? We can't just state that, one biotic factor is sunlight, one abiotic factor is sunlight, one biotic factor is a zooxanthellae. That's false. Why? Because we didn't use evidence. We need to literally go and use either data that they gave us in this section or stuff that they've explicitly told us in this section to answer this question, right? So the only biotic or abiotic factors that I know of from here are CO2, acidity, temperature, polyps, and zooxanthellae, right? So that's what I'm going to use to support my answer. And I can use either one of these graphs to support that reasoning, or I can use any sentences from these paragraphs to support that further. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's organize our thoughts first. First of all, what are biotic and abiotic factors? Well, abiotic factors are non-living factors, and biotic factors are living factors, right? So abiotic are non-organisms, biotic are organisms. Okay, so what are the non-organism factors that I know of? Well, I know of temperature. I also know of acidity. And I know of the CO2 level. Those are non-living. Those are not organisms. Now, what about the biotic factors? Well, I know that I have zooxanthellae, which are the algae. And I also know that I have the polyps, which are also organisms. So these are my abiotic factors. These are my biotic factors. And finally, I need to show how they're related in terms of the carrying capacity of shell-building organisms. Meaning that, well, what first of all, carrying capacity is just the amount of a certain population that an environment can support. So how do these biotic and abiotic factors affect how many shell-building organisms, which are polyps, can survive in the environment, right? So we can say that, well, first of all, the first abiotic factor, CO2, as the concentration of CO2 increases in the water, the amount of calcium carbonate available to polyps will decrease, meaning that polyps will have less material to build their shells out of, and their population will decrease. Thus, an increase in the concentration of CO2 will decrease the carrying capacity of polyps, right? It'll make it harder for the environment to support more polyps living in that environment. Okay, so that's one perfectly good response you could have said here. As long as you relate any three of these choices with the fact that polyps can survive better or survive worse in those environments and conditions, you would get the point here. So again, you could also say that the temperature graph, shows that ocean temperatures have increased in recent decades. Increased temperature causes zooxanthellae to leave polyps, which contributes to bleaching, thus decreasing the carrying capacity of the corals. Okay, that's another perfectly good response. You could have said how temperature, which is an abiotic factor, impacts the behavior of the zooxanthellae, which is the algae, and how that algae impacts the amount of polyps that can live, which is the carrying capacity of the shell building or polyp organism. You could have also said that as global warming increases or continues, the ocean temperature will continue to rise, and as a result, the coral reefs will experience bleaching, leading to a decrease in the polyp population and a decrease in the carrying capacity of the coral. Right? Remember, the polyps live on the coral, so anything that decreases the number of corals will impact the carrying capacity of the polyps. Okay? So the best thing about this new exam is that there's multiple ways to answer this question because there's so much information or evidence that we can use to support our answer. So again, anything along those lines of what I've said so far would have given you full points on this question right here. Right? The section continues by saying that some species of zooxanthellae and coral have traits that make them more tolerant to the changes of temperature of the water in which they live in. Scientists are experimenting with selective breeding of these species of coral and zooxanthellae to produce a coral that would be more likely to survive changing ocean temperatures. Okay, so now what's happening is that, well, our corals are in really bad shape. They're really sensitive to increases in temperature. So what if we selectively breed them to make them more resistant to increases in temperature, all right? So here we have to identify an explanation that best describes how coral and zooxanthellae populations would be expected to change if the current trend in water temperatures continue, right? So what are the current temperatures? What is the current trend in water temperature? Well, it's going to increase, and it's increasing above the average. That's how you know it's a significant increase, because it's more than average right now. So if the temperature of the water continues to increase, what's going to happen? Well, number one, the population or the proportion of coral and zooxanthellae that can tolerate higher water temperatures will increase because they survive at a higher rate than those that are more sensitive to temperature changes. This is the correct answer, right? Luckily, it was choice number one, but really think about this, right? If the temperature increases, the organisms that are super sensitive, that will die off at the slightest increase of temperature, will all be dead. And the only remaining coral and zooxanthellae that will be present are the ones that are super resistant to temperature changes. This is the concept of natural selection, right? The environment is naturally selecting or favoring species that can tolerate higher temperatures to survive. So over time, if the environment gets warmer, you'll just find species that are better at living in warmer conditions there. Why? Because the more sensitive ones, or the ones that are better evolved to survive in colder conditions, will die off. All right. Choice 2 is a tempting answer, but remember that the coral does not eject zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae themselves eject the coral. Right. Also, if the water temperature continues to rise, the zooxanthellae and coral that are sensitive to cold water temperatures will die. They won't survive. They won't be able to go around, hopping from one coral to the other. They'll be dead. They can't live in those hot water conditions. Okay. The proportion of coral and zooxanthellae that are cold water tolerant will increase. This is false because if the water is getting more and more hot, your resistance to cold water is useless. So you will actually die off because you're not better at surviving in hotter temperatures like like choice 1 says you are. Right? So this is actually the opposite of choice 1. The proportion of hot water resistant zooxanthellae will increase, not cold water resistant ones. And choice 4 is wrong because the coral will take in zooxanthellae that are sensitive to high water temperatures. That's false, right? The zooxanthellae is already inside of the coral. They can't take in zooxanthellae, right? They're already inside of the coral. So that's the first reason why it's wrong. The second reason is that the coral doesn't take in the zooxanthellae. The algae or the zooxanthellae can select the coral that they live on. So again, choices 2 and 4 misread how zooxanthellae and coral respond and react to one another, right? The zooxanthellae lives on the coral. The coral is just the house, right? The zooxanthellae can choose which house they want to live inside of, okay? That's why choice 1 is correct. Finally, this section is concluded by this small piece of text. It says that if they are successful in producing a type of coral that can thrive in changing water conditions, the scientists claim that transplanting these selectively bred corals will reduce or restore bleached and dying reefs. So again, if we are able to selectively breed for this super coral that can, survive in like boiling water, and we bring it back into the environment, we can restore the environment, right? We can continue to rebuild these reefs because all of a sudden these new reefs don't care about changes in ocean temperature. So again, one benefit here is that the heat tolerant corals will thrive in oceans with warmer temperatures, or temps, right? To shorten it. That's one benefit, right? Another benefit is that if they are actually able to survive in warmer temperatures, the biodiversity of the coral reef environment will increase. So another benefit you could have wrote was that biodiversity will increase or go up. Why? Well, simply because you have more corals present. The coral is the home or the habitat of many, many different species. So if all of a sudden you're now increasing the size of this habitat, more species can live inside of there and the biodiversity will increase. You could also say that the stability of the environment can also increase, or that more coral will survive to build up new sections of reef. You could have also said that the selectively bred corals will restore the reefs. And another benefit could be that their newly restored reef will increase tourism to new areas, right? So that's an economic benefit. So again, those are all of the benefits here, right? The regents, again, they allow you to say many, many things because you have so much information to base this off of, okay? Now, let's talk about drawbacks. Well, the most obvious drawback here is that you're introducing a non-native species into the environment, right? These selectively bred organisms are non-native. Why? Because we're taking them out of the environment, bringing them to a lab, and then selectively breeding them inside of a laboratory, right? So technically, they're not native to that environment, and they could become invasive to whatever environment we now place them in. So a drawback is that the selectively bred, selectively bred coral may become an invasive species to the environment it's placed in. Okay, so again, that's one drawback. What do invasive species do? Well, they can disrupt the food web, right, or the food chain. So again, that's another drawback. So you could have said that the transplanted corals will disrupt existing food webs. You could have also said that the growing corals, the coral or the newly resistant coral will grow too slowly to actually repair any damage caused by an increased ocean temperature. You could have also said that the process of replacing selectively bred corals is too difficult or too expensive and is not sustainable for humans to do. Another drawback. You could have also said that selectively breeding corals does not reduce the increase in ocean temperature, right? So even these heat-resistant organisms may not survive in further warmer environments, right? It's not like you fixed the issue of global warming. You just made someone that can temporarily survive in these hotter climates. But if the climate keeps getting hotter, even this super resistant coral could once again die if the temperatures become more or far too high, right? So again, those are all of the correct answers that you could have said when mentioning the drawbacks of this, okay? And that is also the end of this section, right? The end of this cluster. So this was 6 questions, and you can really see here how you're following a storyline, right? You were introduced to corals, then you were introduced to an issue, the cause of an issue, and then a possible solution to the issue. And from here, it's not like you were just asked about, okay, what is photosynthesis? What is DNA? What is a coral? You were actually asked to build on ideas that were brought up in these passages, right? And you were asked to support claims and arguments again. So this is new, right? This is a new way of testing for biology. I hope this video helped. If you have any questions from any of these questions that I went over today, please let me know in the comments down below. I'm currently sick, so it does make explaining a little bit difficult. So I really appreciate anyone who watched up until this part of the video. Again, if anything was confusing, please let me know in the comments below. I can explain it again. I will also be uploading more of these videos soon, so keep posted for those. I will definitely go over more clusters that I can find on the internet. This is just the first one that I can find. All right, so I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you have a nice day.